Hot Sikaten Oikalo. Good evening, everyone. Hello, Monique Duas, Julian Ankney. My name is Julian Ankney, and I am a co-director for the Visiting Writers Series and the director for Native American programs at WCU Vancouver. Thank you for joining us here today and welcoming author Addie Tsai to Washington State University's Spring Visiting Writers Series. I'd like to thank our partners, the English Department at WCU Pullman and Vancouver, WCU Tri-Cities, Native American programs, the Common Reading Series, ASWSU, and Landscapes, the Campus Literary Journal. I also want to thank our tech wizard, Rob Baker. Without him, we would literally cease to exist, as well as my co-conspirator, co-director in this series, Cameron McGill. Cameron will be manning the chat here tonight. Again, Patsy out, Cameron. Thank you all, our esteemed audience, for making time to be with us virtually for this event. We are all far flung in these virtual times, and we love to see you put in the chat where you're all from. Tonight, I come to you from Nchiwana in Sahapton, or for all you English speakers, the Lower Columbia River. The Lower Columbia River has been inhabited and stewarded by numerous tribes and bands of Indigenous people since time immemorial. And these people continue to have a deep connection to the land and waters. The broad geography of the Lower Columbia historically included dozens of seasonal and permanent villages and interconnecting web of tribal affiliations. Tribes including the Chinook, Clatsop, Klamath, Wakayakum, Multnomah, Cascades, Tualatin, Molalla, Wasco, Clackamas, Cowlitz, and Skilloot have ancestral connections to the Lower Columbia and continue to be stewards of the river. We recognize that tribal territories were often shared and overlapping, and that this may be an incomplete list of who lived on these lands. I am a guest here, and I want to thank the original caretakers of this land. Land is important to me personally for many reasons. The land on which WCU Vancouver sits. In fact, WCU locations statewide are on the homelands of Indigenous people. And I would also like to remind everyone that land acknowledgements are just one little baby step towards honoring Indigenous people's long presence on all U.S. land and recognizing their continuing connection to the earth, water, air, and to their Anaconma ancestors. Before we would begin, I would like to go over a couple housekeeping items. Please use the YouTube chat to engage and respond throughout the reading. And we'll also have a Q&A after Tsai's reading, where you can ask all of your burning questions. If you are here for the Common Reading event, we will put the Qualtrics link in the chat towards the end of the reading. So please watch for that for credit. Again, put your hands and voices, little tiny war hoop, virtual hands together for author Addie Tsai. Annie All is a queer, non-binary artist and writer of color who teaches creative writing at William and Mary. They also teach in Goddard's College MFA program in interdisciplinary arts and Regis University's Mile High MFA program in creative writing. Addie collaborated with Dominique Walsh, dance, theater on Victor Frankenstein and Camille Claudel, among others. They earned an MFA from Warren Wilson College and a PhD in dance from Texas Women's University. Addie is the author of Dear Twin and Unwieldy Creatures, which was nominated for a Shirley Jackson Award for Best Novel. She's the fiction co-editor and editor of Feature and Reviews at Anomaly, contributing writer at Spectrum South, and founding editor-in-chief at the LGBTQIA plus fashion, literary, and arts magazine, Just Femme and Dandy. Once again, Yao Yao, please put your hands together for Addie Tsai. Again, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here and to read from this novel for all of you. I am reading to you from the ancestral lands of Powhatan, also known as Richmond, Virginia, and I'll be reading from Unwieldy Creatures, which is a queer biracial Asian retelling of Frankenstein. So I'll read from 3 different sections, and then hopefully we have some questions that I would love to answer for you. So Unwieldy Creatures focuses on a few characters. If you have read the original Frankenstein, Captain Walton is replaced by Plum, whose given name is Lee, and Plum is a biracial Chinese intern who works at Dr. Frank, who is biracial Indonesian, who is an embryologist who runs her own reproductive sciences lab, and that's where Plum interns. We also have, I'm trying to think who else I want to tell you about right now. We also have the creature who will show up later on, as well as Hana, who is Japanese and Spanish, and is Dr. Frank's like childhood sweetheart. Okay, so I'm gonna start early in the beginning, and it's where Plum, the intern, and Dr. Frank come to meet one another. Dangi Shah, let me start over. The last night of my summer internship, Dr. Wong, the head of the intern program, and I had to physically restrain Dr. Frank, the owner of FFI, so she wouldn't cause a scene. She's actually the reason I wanted to get into embryo research. I read a book by her I found in the library on a cold night when I was trying to stay out of the streets and keep warm for as long as I could. It was called The Frankenstein Dilemma, A Future Without Men. And the way she interrogated how to do away with the need for sperm entirely was nothing short of miraculous. In fact, no one even knew her given last name. Everyone had been told to call her Dr. Frank because she had been determined, since reading Shelley's masterpiece and cautionary tale, that she would figure out a way to create bodies without sperm. Even without that book, Dr. Frank was at the top of her field, absolutely instrumental in changing how we now think of IVF and embryo sculpting. I was impressed also to learn she was an Asian queer scientist in the southern United States of all places. I would be lying if I didn't admit I'd hoped to follow in her footsteps. Even though Dr. Frank was well regarded for that book, there was also a lot of controversy surrounding the kind of science she encouraged emerging scientists to explore. Before getting the internship, I went to a talk she gave. During the talkback, an audience member asked what she thought of the ethical dilemma of designer babies. Similar to what animal breeders do, but of course, made much more complex and ethically ambiguous given the science involved human embryos. A smug expression fell across Dr. Frank's face, as though even the question itself bemused her. Dr. Frank cleared her throat before she began, adjusted her pristinely starched men's shirt. Oh, well, yes, of course there are ethical concerns with what I'm suggesting, but one can say that about the entire field of reproductive science. That's why the conservatives have been trying to cut IVF funding for decades. These are new times, and they require new means of innovation for thinking beyond that to which we've grown accustomed. Men are, it would seem, finally on their way out, she said with a chuckle, as most of the audience and the moderator laughed alongside her. I looked back at the audience member who seemed a bit embarrassed, smiling awkwardly as he returned the microphone to its stand in the aisle and made his way to the seat. A middle-aged man, perhaps in his 50s, pierced the room with his voice. "You can't be fucking serious," he yelled. He said more, but it was unintelligible because a security guard had covered his mouth, while another guard grabbed him by the arms and led him out of the room. I wish I had attended with a fellow colleague who might have whispered their reaction in my ear, like so many audience members in the auditorium. Years later, I would think back to the moment of that man's question and realize she never answered him. I wonder what became of that dissenter. I'm sure there are many more where he came from. During the last month of my work at the lab, I saw Dr. Wong gossip with the other techs that had been there far longer than me. The whispers seemed to grow louder, as ones attached to scandal tend to do. I could tell people were alarmed and uncomfortable with what they'd been hearing. I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but I heard something about a breakdown and her biggest donors pulling funding. I didn't want my idol to shatter before my eyes, but I couldn't help being curious about what was behind all the whispers. All I knew was something was clearly wrong with Dr. Frank, and I wasn't altogether sure I wanted to know what it was. And then, on the last night of my internship, as we were wrapping up for the night, Dr. Frank blew into the lab like a rash, wild-eyed and pink-faced, her perfectly coiffed hair as frazzled as what seemed to be her state of mind. Her outfit, as always, was elegant and well-tailored. She wore a deep violet suit with a bright green men's shirt. The shirt was untucked, and her thin floral necktie was a bit off kilter, one of the few signs, other than her unkempt hair and complexion, that something was off. Dr. Wong acted fast. She untied her lab apron and threw it to the side. I followed suit. She gestured to me to hold down Dr. Frank's right arm while she held her left. Initially, I was a bit caught off guard that Dr. Frank didn't make any move to resist us. Her teeth clacked against one another, and her skin was frigid to the touch and remained so, even after we took her outside in the blistering southern heat. Not a drop of sweat gathered on her skin. I have to admit, even as I tried to maintain my composure, I was unnerved by her freezing skin, the accelerated speed at which her eyes darted back and forth, like someone on the verge of a mental break. When living on the streets as a runaway teen, you learn a thing or two about how little it takes for people to snap. Whatever was going on, she wasn't well. She kept looking behind her, and I couldn't be sure if she was itching for someone to find her, or petrified that they would. I didn't have enough information myself to make any kind of assessment about whether it was rightful suspicion or paranoid delusion, or both. Dr. Wong gripped her hand as I finished locking up the lab, securing it with the code on the keypad and my thumbprint. We walked her straight to the bathroom in the pub down the street, threw some cold water on her face, and wet her hair back. Dr. Wong took both Dr. Frank's hands into hers a bit awkwardly, as it was obvious their relationship hadn't yet earned this kind of intimacy. Breathe, Dr. Wong commanded, forcefully rubbing her fingers with Dr. Frank's. But you don't understand. I have to get out of here. It could be any... Dr. Frank began in a heightened, accelerated tone of voice. Listen to me. Dr. Wong started, then stopped. She walked over to each of the bathroom stalls, squatted to look underneath to ensure no stall was occupied. Look, I'm not saying I don't believe you. Everything I've heard, who knows what's true? But whatever you're referring to, it's not going to come in here, that's for sure. And out there, anywhere around the lab, people are talking. You're already losing donors because of the rumors. No one's going to give their money to a queer woman of color who might be going crazy in the South. You know this more than I do, okay? Dr. Frank didn't nod, but she didn't interrupt or protest. Dr. Wong continued. This is what I think we should do. How about you go home with Lee, the intern? She's wonderful, and I guarantee you have her utmost discretion. I'd take you with me, but, I have kids and a partner at home. Let's get a bite to eat first, because I think food might calm you down a bit, and also so as not to arouse suspicion. Then Lee will take you to her apartment where you can get some rest, and we can discuss everything else in due time. I doubt whoever is following you will know to look for you there. Dr. Frank's breathing had slowed slightly by this point. She took her hands away from Dr. Wong's and placed her left in her suit coat pocket as always, while the other smoothed down her wet hair. She nodded. Dr. Wong, very much in charge, led us out of the bathroom. Dr. Wong was right. If she'd stayed in the lab in that state, a tech or a janitor most likely would have reported her. Who knows where she would have ended up? Maybe they would have called the police, had her arrested, or even institutionalized. A great mind like hers? What a fucking tragedy that would be. Like Claudel, sequestered just as she hit her prime. Not on my watch. At least, not if there's anything I could do about it. Dr. Wong tried to normalize things at dinner. She introduced us, told Dr. Frank about the work I had been doing. Over a comforting meal of burgers and ciders, her brown face began to recede back to its normal shade, and her chestnut brown hair, just a touch or two lighter than mine, resumed its usual relaxed position as it gradually dried and fell away from her face. But she still didn't utter a single word. After dinner, we caravanned in 2 cars to my apartment. The lab had furnished me with a generous stipend that allowed for comfortable housing. I'd already paid through the next month, since I was still debating my next move, and honestly, hanging around in the hopes FFI would take me on in a more permanent capacity. And so it was that I took care of Dr. Frank, my superior and my idol, for the next few days as she slept on my pull-out sofa. I tried to offer her my bed, but she refused with a vigorous shake of her head. I fed her Shalongbao New Roman I'd picked up that day from a local dumpling house and offered her constant water and cocooned her in blankets in hopes it would ease the chill, determined to rest in her bones. At times, I inquired about Dr. Frank's level of comfort, or if she had finished a mug of tea or a bowl of soup I'd offered her. She just nodded or shook her head accordingly. After a few days, the initial wildness in her fell away little by little, and she finally began to look like the version of her I was most familiar with from afar. On those rare occasions when she would breeze through the lab with prospective donors, or from the many videos I watched of the talks she gave around the world, the warmth returned to her cheeks. After asking for her permission, I touched her skin to check for a fever or prolonged chills. I was pleased its temperature no longer made me recoil inwardly in shock. On the 5th day, she finally spoke for the first time since Dr. Wong had silenced her panic-stricken cries. I was so eager to talk to her, but also somewhat hesitant to ask what it was that had transformed her into such a frenzied, distressed creature, that initially I only viewed her from my own obsessively inquisitive lens. After all, this was my chance to ask the person I admired most in the world anything I wanted. When would I get that exposure to an expert like Dr. Frank again? I asked about her research, and she seemed relieved by the opportunity to speak about it. After so many days of absolute silence, I was struck by the smooth eloquence with which she spoke, and moved by how forthcoming she was with her ideas and research, what led her to her field of study, how she developed her game-changing hypothesis. I, on the other hand, became so starstruck I could barely get words out of my awkwardly small mouth fast enough as I tried to shove 50 words at once. Inadvertently, my sentences were accompanied by an agitated stutter. Wasai. She smiled gracefully as I stumbled over myself in excitement and fervor, responding as though I were her colleague, and not an awkward fan geeking out. It felt like a dream come true, and yet at times it felt selfish and narcissistic to only consider what knowledge I could gain from someone so clearly in pain. She asked me about my own studies, and even though Dr. Wong had told her all of this when we had first met, I didn't mind refreshing her memory. She seemed particularly intrigued by my being a runaway teen, an aspect of my story not even Dr. Wong knew, and one I didn't anticipate revealing so quickly. She was very curious to hear how I transitioned from the streets to such a prestigious position. I could tell it sparked something in her that related to whatever she currently grappled with, but I tried not to pry. Eventually, though, leaning towards me with an elbow on each knee, Dr. Frank forced my hand. You've been very sweet not to meddle in my affairs, especially given how generous you were to offer your wonderful home as my hiding place. But I can tell you're dying to know what's behind my peculiar behavior and exactly what I'm hiding from. I'm no fool. I know everyone in the lab is talking about me. Scientists try to act above such pettiness, but they gossip just as much as the next person. Maybe even more. She smiled, looking directly into my eyes with a candor I hadn't seen her express thus far. Gave me a little wink. The wind I held tight inside me collapsed as though I'd been holding my breath for days. I cleared my throat, unsure of how to respond. Yeah, well, I mean, of course I've heard little whispers here and there, but I try to just focus on my work and move on. But please, if you want to talk about what's going on for you, I'm happy to listen. I placed my hand on her knee in a somewhat forced attempt to offer compassion instead of voyeurism. She smiled. I do want to tell you my story, if for nothing more than to warn you, for I feel there is something in our stories, what I could intimate of yours at this point anyway, that unites each to each. Maybe the only good that can come of what happened to me is its potential to help another, like you. I can see that danger's twinkle in your eye already. It would mean something to me if I could at least save a fellow scientist and an inquisitive mind like yours from a future of torment. I giggled out of recognition. This is no laughing matter, but oh, I remember what it was to be you. So young, headstrong, The world at your fingers. You don't know what I mean yet, but I think you'll see once I tell you all there is to say. I was puzzled by her introduction to whatever she was preparing to tell me. It was ominous, but like she said, I was young, naive, and too full of the elixir of ambition to even guess what she was hinting at. Now it was her turn to reach towards me. Her eyes returned to a bit of their earlier wildness as she tried to implore me to receive what she would divulge. I also felt that with the intensity of her gaze, she was testing me as well, trying to see if I could handle it. I did my best to return her gaze, but I was so enthralled by her that it was hard to focus once I felt the skin of her hand. A soft tingle of electricity shot up my arm, but I tried to appear as nonchalant and earnest as possible. I couldn't help but want it to mean something, that I was special enough to be touched, that only I was privileged enough to hear her story. After Ma, after Ba, it was hard not to find myself drawn to her, if only because someone as important as she seemed drawn to me. It didn't occur to me not to get ahead of myself, to even wait to hear what she had to tell me before riding that train of hope and anticipation. I knew what I wanted it to mean. Rookie mistake. Dr. Frank excused herself and left the room. My heart dropped to my stomach as I assumed I'd ruined everything with my insecurities and pride, my one chance to connect with my idol. Before I could sink too far into my own self-shaming, she returned with an old tape recorder and a box of unused cassettes, still protected in their shrink wrap. I want to tell you the entire story. If anything happens to me, promise me that you will share my story with the world. I nodded solemnly. That's when she began to tell me what happened to her, a story so akin to my own, and yet which took turns so frighteningly separate that I feel I have no other recourse but to share it. Besides, there's no way to tell my story without telling hers too. Just as she did all those years ago, now I too feel compelled to share it in hopes it will keep others from the choices that took me down my own foreboding path. Perhaps communication with another is the only thing we have to keep us from the darker depths of fate. Okay, now I'm going to read a really short section of part of Dr. Frank's youth, and this is when she meets her childhood love, Hannah. And at this point, her mother is Indonesian and her father's white, and they live in West Texas. Hannah and I immediately formed a bond, the likes of which I'd never before experienced with anyone. It was far more complex than the charming attachment even Ezra and I had with one another. Ezra replaces Elizabeth and is the adoptive brother. As Hannah and I got to know each other, I learned that her father was Japanese and her mother was from Virginia. And so we spent many hours commiserating on what it was like to have within us such differing, warring worlds. Her father was a simple furniture salesman, and her mother waitressed in a diner down the street from the bookstore. At times, she would sing at jazz clubs in the larger cities that were close by. I knew the minute that Hannah told me that her mother was a waitress, which restaurant she worked at, as her similarly untamed curls and striking beauty were hard to miss. I giggled when I told her this, and hid my face in my hand to hide my blushing skin. That's when Hannah knew that when I told her I remembered her mother's beauty, I meant it to reveal what I thought of her as well. I had never told another girl I was drawn to her, or even admitted that I was attracted more to girls than to boys. I wouldn't exactly say that I consciously made my attraction known to Hannah either. It was as though the impulse to reveal my innermost feelings for Hannah came from within my body, but also beyond it. And I didn't think about the ramifications before I told her what she meant to me. It took time for Hannah to respond with her feelings in kind. I knew she felt somewhat the same for me by her acceptance of my attractions towards her, for not withdrawing from me when it was clear I meant to court her. I would later learn she had surprisingly accepting parents who were also her greatest confidants. They had guided her well and taught her not to rush into new relationships. I would later become resentful that Hannah had the kind of parents a young queer person would dream of, not only because she could rely on them for support, but also because it was wanting to stay close to them that ultimately kept her farther from me. I didn't know what kind of romantic partner I was, for there was never anyone I fell for who would have brought those aspects of my character out of me. When I became attracted to girls I passed by in the square on my way to the bookstore or to the library, I never allowed myself to indulge in the feelings, which faded away quickly. When I met Hannah, I'd been waist high in my intellectual pursuits, and romantic encounters, or love, were the last thing on my mind. Nothing tended to conquer my passion for my studies. As Hannah and I became closer, I was surprised to find lurking within me the predilections and impulses of a gentleman. It was not only the manner I desired to pursue Hannah that felt most gentlemanly, it was also how I wanted to dress myself for the occasions I would take Hannah out on the town, and other patterns of behavior inspired by my favorite Elizabethan novels and films that felt gentlemanly. Over the course of our relationship, we would spend time having dinner with Hannah's parents, which brought up for me a myriad of complicated feelings. Hannah's parents had a sweetness with each other I wanted desperately to witness between my own parents. All I had seen my parents express was anger and fear. Still, it was deeply affirming to have Hannah's parents seem truly happy for us, to share our love with any other people besides the two of us. Her parents were a true partnership, even all the way down to the dinner table. We would have ramen and homemade sushi next to collard greens and chicken fried steak. It was impossible to resist their charms. Ever so often, Hannah's father would touch his hand to the small of her mother's back, or beam at her with just a look, and it was enough to bring me to tears. Shortly after we met, I planned to borrow the family car and drive Hannah to a nearby city, where they were staging a queer adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. We had made a plan that we would dress for the occasion, even if we were the only ones to do so. We were young queers in love. In order to fully take on the fantasy I was eager to lavish on Hannah, I needed money not made readily available to me. It required confiding in someone. My grandmother was too conventional and would never understand. I tried my mother and hoped for the best, for I knew if I misjudged her ability to accept me, it could have disastrous consequences. On one of our outings into town, I sat in the car with my mother while we waited for Ezra to finish perusing his favorite gallery's latest exhibition. Ma, I started, unsure of how to begin. My mother looked out the window aimlessly. It was only after she heard me clear my throat she realized this was no ordinary conversation. What is it? Is it Ezra? Did Pa do something? My mother's line of questions made me feel worse for bringing this up, for wanting dapper outfits and my mother's support of a brand new romance, which might not even go anywhere, when there were far graver concerns to consider in our lives. But my heart needed her approval. No, nothing like that, Ma. Remember that new friend I told you about, Hannah? My mother exhaled and started looking out the window again. Oh, yes. Her father's Japanese, right? Mother is pretty, works in restaurants, and sings out of town? I blushed, thinking of Hannah again. Yes, that's her. Well, but I'm taking her out next week to see a play, a date, and I want to dress like a Kalali. My mother said nothing at first, just raised her eyebrow, darkened and shaped with black coal. Date? A Kalali? Really? How did you learn this? You know this doesn't come from our region, right? The anxiety of the moment overwhelmed me. Yes, I know. In a book I found at the bookstore, but that's the easiest way to explain how I feel, I said sheepishly. Kalali was a term I read in a book I found on the Bugis, the largest ethnic group in South Sulawesi, Indonesia. Their language accounts for 5 different gender categories, and Kalali is their gender term for masculine women. The first time I read the passage in the book, my skin tingled in recognition and validation of a way my body felt that I'd never heard or even knew existed. And even better, it was a word that came from the same country as my own mother, as close to my birthright as I could get. You are dressing for fun, like costume? Or you really feel you're a Kalali? She peered into my eyes, which I kept downward. I didn't know how to answer her, so I started to cry, holding my head in my hands. My mother had never been one for my tears. She awkwardly patted my shoulder, then roughly grabbed my chin with one hand and demanded it upwards to look back at her. Okay, Zoe, okay. You must be very careful because you do not know what these Texans, even in parts of Indonesia, even when we have words for, people that are different, it is still not easy. And there's your father to worry about. Be careful, okay? And you must never call yourself Kalai publicly, especially to Indonesians. It is not our language to claim. Okay? I nodded. But where is this play? Once my mother started talking logistics, I knew it would be okay. It is not here. It is far away. Okay, do you need money for outfit? I nodded again, wiping the tears from my face now that I saw Ezra walking towards our car. Zoelle, listen. She stroked my hair then, an impulse that was infrequent, but of a comfort to me. Do not tell Ezra about this. Do not tell your father. And be very careful how you are with her, or any girl, in public. This is for your own good, understand? The world can be hard. It is too harsh already to us. Oh, and your grandmother, your Nanette, she will never understand. I will hide some money for outfit in your pillowcase. She paused for a beat, thinking. I think she is nice girl, she said slowly, and the smallest smile inched across her mouth. I grinned as warmth radiated through my chest. Just a moment later, I saw Ezra walking towards the car, and so I tried to look as casual as possible. And so it was that I learned I was Kalai, and to keep it secret. I picked Hannah up in our family car the day of the play, wearing a deep purple waistcoat, a pink ruffled blouse with a high neck, and forest green men's trousers I had my father's tailor alter for my shape. I went to the barber shop on the way. It was a Thursday night, a day I knew the one-woman barber worked, and I asked her to give me a men's cut with a tight fade. I can't articulate how it felt to come into my own body, my own style, my own Kalai. She knew that I was about to head to my first date, and so she sprinkled talcum powder against my neck, and as she brushed it against my skin, I sighed with pleasure at my new self, and with my mother's blessing. I only hoped Hannah would approve. Hannah looked ravishing. Her red hair shone in a way it hadn't before. She wore an ankle-length, blue pleated skirt, a green satin button-down blouse, and soft pink ballet flats made to look like point shoes with a box toe and thick straps across the front. Her lips were painted a sparkling mauve, and her jade drop earring shone against the rapidly dissolving daylight. As usual, she took my breath away, but it was deeply reassuring to see her react to my transformation. Impulsively, Hannah took one hand and rubbed it against the back of my neck. I sighed audibly as Hannah beamed at me, a smile I'd never seen before, as though she were seeing me for the first time. I guess we both were. Okay, and now I'm just going to read one final section. And this is the creature story. And this is the origin story for the creature, but the background is that Dr. Frank abandons the creature at the base of a tree, and a man named Pine finds the creature and begins to care for this creature. You will get a few couple spoilers, but you can forget it when you read the book. Because Pine and I banded together against the world, I did not come of age in the gender binary world that you and all other welcome bodies are accustomed to. As Pine taught me to read and write, he also gave me what neither you nor my father, if father he could be called, could give, a name that befits my particular way of being. The name he gave me came from his understanding and love of all that I was, but the occasion that caused me to finally possess my own name was born of such torment as you will never experience. On this particular afternoon, Pine had gone to scavenge for supplies and soup when I began feeling feverish from a cold after a few days of hard rain. The rain had let up at this point, and so, bored and curious as young children often are, I began to explore the woods a bit more than I did when Pine watched over me. I took a stick with me and a handful of small pebbles so that I could trace a line in the dirt and drop the pebbles where I wandered to easily find my way back to our shoddy and makeshift camp. I discovered a small stream I had never seen before, so I had never traveled this far, that cut through the woods. I leaned over the cold stream to run my hands through the water, excited at a new sensation. I was perhaps 7 years old at this point, and although I had some innate sense I was growing larger more quickly than expected, Pine had to frequently replace my torn and tattered clothes and figure out different strategies to keep my feet protected. This was the first time I remember being faced with my own reflection. It is no understatement to say the face that stared back at me in the folds of blue absolutely terrorized and frightened me. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The monstrous figure, shadowy but clear enough to discern its hideousness, couldn't possibly be my own reflection. I whipped my head around, hoping I would see another figure behind me, one to account for this confrontation. But I was alone. I didn't interact enough with others to understand what beauty was exactly, but I had read enough in all the books Pine gave me that I was not filled with any sense of peace or comfort in glimpsing my own lopsided face, the grotesque proportions of my body, or the strange copper hair that covered every inch of my skin. I fixated on the image that stared back at me for so long that I lost track of time, my hysterical tears falling down my threadbare clothes and dropping into the water below, the thing responsible for the sight of ugliness. Finally, Pine found me. I suppose he followed the line I cut into the dirt. It did not take him long to figure out what had happened, as he noticed my expression that held the depths of pain I felt at viewing how wretched I imagined I looked to all others. He held me for a long time, saying nothing at all, and for this I will always be grateful, for he knew there were no words of denial he could offer to appease me. My worst thoughts were irrefutable. After I'd cried all the tears left in me, at least on that day, he sat down and spoke with me about what he had been able to find out about where I came from. I have waited many years to tell you who it is you come from because I wanted to be sure, and because I wanted you to be old enough to understand the complexities of your birth. Your story is not like the others, Pine said, holding my hand as we sat on the hard, plain ground beneath us. Although I felt soothed by his touch as always, I knew it came with something dark and terrible that I would need to be comforted for. And so, in this moment, his touch frightened me. I had a sense that when I found you, you were only a few days old. There is a hospital not far from here, and I figured one of your parents had left you here shortly after your birth. He paused. There is a kind man that works at the hospital who has often given me used uniforms and shoes, leftover food from the food court that would have gone to waste. I have known him a long time and have always been grateful to him. He is someone I know that I can trust. So I asked him if he would try to find out if there was a child that was delivered shortly before the day that I found you, and if he could find out any information for me. Pine briefly took his hand back and wiped his face. He grabbed his old worn backpack behind him and pulled out some pieces of paper with text printed on them. Before I give this to you, I want to tell you the story. I want it to come from someone who loves you. These people responsible for your birth do not matter anymore. I love you, and you are safe. And that is all that matters. Your parents are both scientists, and although they are not blood related, they lived together in the same family for many years. The woman who carried you does not share your DNA, but she would have been a loving parent to you if she could have found it within herself to care for you. I think, based on this letter, she would have. She died during complications of childbirth. He paused. Many people in the world get hung up on ambition. They lose sight of what's important. He stroked my long, greasy hair and cupped his hand around the back of my neck. You have always been such a treasure to me. If you know anything, know that. He held a letter from Silber, who, as you know, was the midwife at my birth, addressed to Pine's friend, whose name was David Black. He and Silber were not close, but because Silber's clients often ended up, for one reason or another, needing to be admitted to the hospital for safer births than she could provide, they had grown fond of one another. David had a feeling that Silber might know something of what had happened to this mysterious child Pine spoke of, and so he reached out to her. She was grateful to be asked after so many years about the most tragic case she had worked in all of her years as a midwife. In fact, losing Hannah in such a disastrous way had struck her so deeply that she never returned to midwifery and changed occupations altogether. Silber wouldn't discover until a few days after Hannah's death that Hannah had sent her a letter shortly before she went into labor, telling her all that had transpired to bring me into the world. Hannah had predicted that she might not make it through the delivery. She assumed rightly that you would never tell anyone what had happened, and so she left this knowledge with Silber, a woman she trusted, and the only one she imagined would keep this story safe, until it was the right time to reveal it. This letter told the entire story of how I was conceived and delivered. I learned I live with a condition called gigantism due to a genetic mutation that came from both you and my father. It was this day I learned who you were, and through Hannah's letter, I also found out what Ezra had done to cause you to scorn my birth. I discovered Ezra did not just want revenge for being rejected. It was his greed, like my grandfather's, that caused him to lay claim to everything he sought, and that was also the agent which destroyed my chance at beauty and happiness in the real world. Both of you were responsible for the source of my repugnance, the reason I had been abandoned and left to die. I felt great sadness for my mother, Hannah, carrying me against her will only to lose her life at the end. and tremendous guilt that it was my body that killed her. At the same time, I was unspeakably grateful to Silber for her generosity and willingness to share my story with another, and for David to share her story with Pine, who shared it with me. Without a story of where you come from, how do you understand the ground beneath you that holds your feet? In Silber's letter, she wrote that Hannah spoke of your Kalalai, a word I had never heard before but was intrigued by. I didn't know I was part Malay and Chinese, that my grandmother grew up in Indonesia. It gave me great happiness to learn my birth story. Pine used this conversation as an opportunity to talk about what it meant to be male and female, and how Pine had learned long ago to reject the constraints of societal dictates of gender and race and everything else in between. Pine offered me a name to hold on to, like a home where none could be found. Not for someone like me, not for someone like Pine. He asked how I felt about the name Ash. Pine explained how the word signified both the body of a tree and the absence of it, and that he'd read that ash trees are at once male and female, flower and tree. It was perfect. Not only did it resonate with my split and liminal nature, but I loved its connection to the only person who had ever loved me. It would always remind me of Pine, the only family I'd ever hoped to find. From that point on, I had a name to call my own, a name to remind me of where I came to live in the middle of the woods and where I first found love. I wanted to live with Pine forever, but I would discover that my mutant body and self would keep me from that constant too. Together, we found a suitable singular pronoun that wasn't gendered, one that came from my grandmother's birthland of Indonesia, Dia. I liked the sound of it. I thought, if I ever were to be in a situation in which a pronoun would need to be used for me, if I ever became part of the world, this would be the pronoun I would use. It felt perfect given my dual gendered self, my thinginess. I told Pine this immediately. He smiled and assured me if there were ever a need for him to refer to me in the third person, he would make sure to address me in the way I desired. As I was reading about your Kalai, I came across the word bisu, which technically translates to transvestite priest, but has evolved over the modern age in South Sulawesi to describe someone intersex or even metagender. When Pine and I read about bisu, we both looked at one another at the same moment, and we knew this was me. I rolled the word around on my tongue, smiling, feeling squishy and soft in my body as I uttered it. And so I tell you now that my name is Ash, and I'm a bisu. And I hope you can understand why, in all future cases, both within my company and beyond it, I want to be referred to by the pronoun dia. Thank you.
Great. This is always like, can you see me? I'm not sure. I hope everyone can. So, oh my gosh, Katia, yeah, I just love watching watching you enunciate because I'm a weirdo. I'm like a language revitalizationist myself. So the first question actually comes from me because I got to get mine in there first. Sorry, kids. A's. But as an Imipu woman, I am currently learning my heritage language, and it has basically like shown me um, through learning language, like my root verbs, my suffixes and prefixes and cislocatives, but it also shows me like ontologies and epistemology. So we have a word in Imipu Timt, the Nez Perce language, that means star, Hitsiyu. And if we add a yaya on there, Hitsiyu yaya, that essentially means star being, or um, people who have originated or came from the stars. And I always thought, like, hey, that's kind of like the Big Bang Theory. Here we are, Indigenous people still teaching, um, different, again, ontologies and epistemologies through our heritage language. And of course, form follows function, but when you're experimenting, or combining, I should say, your heritage language with like English. My question for you is no, here's the question, my long question. How has your heritage language um, and culture like shaped your writing?
I really love that you're having that experience and exploration. And actually, I'm definitely not fluent in my birth tongue, which I would consider Mandarin. I know bits and pieces. Have no relationship to Indonesia or Malaysia at all. So that was just something that I decided to bring into Unwieldy Creatures. But I'm always bringing in, and there is Mandarin in this book. There is characters and pinyin and footnotes that explain what the words mean. Some of them are words I know, and some of them are words that I look up. Um,
I
Putting
love the footnote. You know to say that.
yes, yes. And it's really important to me to have those languages intersecting, but also even as somebody that's not fluent, Mandarin is still something that feels like home, even when I can't understand it. One of the things that reminds me of home the most is if I'm just at a Chinese restaurant and I just like hear Mandarin around me. And even the like lack of familiarity, even the lack of understanding what they're saying is part of this like home space. So that is that's a liminality that I want to present in the books that I write. But it's really funny that you asked me this question right now because I have been I'm sort of working on it. It's a sort of sequel to Unwieldy Creatures, and none of it takes place in the United States. So it's going to take place in Singapore, Indonesia, and Taiwan. But I really feel that I need to go to Taiwan in order to finish this book, which I haven't been to Taiwan since I was 4 years old. And I also feel like I want to have some command of Mandarin so that when I am able to get to Taiwan, that I'm not going to have this like horrible time feeling like uncomfortable and just like really disoriented. And so I've been thinking about this a lot. And then I went to a reading and Jane Wong was about to read these poems that were sort of coming out of her experience of learning Cantonese. And she's in this Zoom class and the teacher is just like hardcore scolding her about her wrong use of tones. And there was just like I felt really emotional about it. There was like something about her saying that to a public audience that I thought, like if Jane Wong can be up here talking about being a bad Cantonese student, then like then I can learn Mandarin. So yes, I had a real complicated relationship because my father did not teach it to us, but also did not allow us to really like be an American, like just American kid life. He was very strict. And so I I mean, I've done a lot of therapy, but I did for a long time resent the fact that I don't know Mandarin, that he chose to keep it from us. But late Gen Xers, this is what they were taught. They were supposed to immerse us
Mhm.
in the culture. They were supposed to assimilate us. So I do think he's a product of that time. But I'm really curious that if I can, like this is like this huge hurdle that I need to cross. And if I can cross this hurdle, not only how will that change my relationship to that language, but also what will happen to the books, like what will happen to my writing then. So stay tuned, but yeah, complicated. I'm really excited to hear how this continues to go for you though. That sounds incredible. And this feels like another sign that I need to learn Mandarin.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So of course, when I began my own journey of language, reclamation, I was getting corrected all the time. I was like, oh dang it. I know I'm gonna say something wrong. I'm gonna get corrected and it's gonna be in front. I was so scared. But then I had another mentor tell me like the reason your mentors or your aunties, your family, or your elders, right, are correcting you is because they want you to, speak something phonetically but right so that you don't look stupid. And I'm like, oh, well, yeah, duh. And then I was told, and they're not correcting you. It might seem harsh, in the tone of their correction, but that they're correcting you not because they hate you, they're actually correcting you, because they love you. And I'm like, what? Yes, I love that. So every time I get corrected, and I always tell my students this too, because that's something I learned. Like every time I correct you, it's not that I'm correcting you, it's because I want you to become, again, we have that term in my people's language, nimipu now, or becoming nimipu, becoming a real person through language and all that reclamation. Um, and then something else kind of struck me when you were talking about your parents or your grandparents and having, kind of been in that generation where like assimilation was, something that they completely practice. And I've had a lot of students, and one student in particular asked me like, you know, I feel I feel some kind of way about my parents not doing these things for me, and then I was on the other side of the spectrum, kind of, or the other side of the argument, and I'm like, you know, you have to also think about it as during those times you either had to assimilate, um, or like die. You had to really really embody that assimilation process and instill it in your kids, to ensure their survival.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like such a double-edged sword. Like, oh, I really wish they would have done that, but at the same time, like, I understand why. So I was just kind of wondering, what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, I think I mean I do think that immigrant parents were really sold this story that first of all that bilingualism couldn't happen. Just too difficult, too confusing, was going to create too many problems, which we now know is not only not true, but the more you speak multiple languages to children, the more their brains actually have capacity
Mhm.
to switch in language. I definitely think that I also have more sympathy for my father, who was a single parent of three children. I have a twin. My brother is 18 months older than me. And so I do think part of it was just like overwhelmed, just became easier to just speak English. But I do think that kind of like cultural script of coming to America and assimilating was it's not like it is now. It's not like you could go onto a computer and find 3,000 different theories about an experience you're having. It was like you only saw there was no internet. You only saw the media.
What did you do?
You had the media telling you to assimilate, the teachers, the school districts, the institutional spaces, and that was it. I think, one of the things I actually didn't know until very recently was that my father was still he was still a permanent resident when I was born too. So I also now look back at that time less, more generous towards him, and understanding that I don't know that he was like fearing getting deported, but I think he had a very clear like anxiety around the American government not having gained citizenship yet. And so yeah, so I think that I have, I have a different perspective on it. But when I was growing up, I was just like, you're surrounding us with Chinese people. You're not letting me hang out with my friends, and we
Mhm.
can't communicate. Like, this sucks. But yeah, and I'm, and I'm glad that it's getting better. I'm glad that the kind of cultural landscape, cultural conversation around this has changed so dramatically, and that we are really pushing for a fluidity between heritage and language, and not having to choose one, as a mixed.
Oh my gosh, yes, especially a mixed person, right? Like, I had one friend tell me, because they're both Mimi Poo and Black, and someone asked them, "Well, what do you consider yourself? You consider yourself more Black or more Nini Poo. They're like, how could you ask me, or how could you, ask my mother to choose? How could you ask me to choose when both of those halves are what makes me complete? And I thought that that was just so beautiful. So yes,
No,
thank you so much. I could literally talk
I,
forever just on language.
yeah.
So our next question is like, I probably should check up some audience questions. Thank you. It's from Nathan Walters. What is something an editor could do to make the process easier or more efficient? And part two, what was the hardest part of the publishing process for you?
Editor could do to make the process easier or more efficient. I don't really know how to answer the first question because I had a really incredible acquisitions editor. Her name is Lisa Pegram, and yeah, she was just incredible. I think one of the things that why I picked her, I had gotten quite a bit of attention from agents, but one of the things that I liked about her was from the gate, she was like, these are all the praises of this novel. This is why this novel deserves to be in the world. This is an experience that we aren't getting in the world as much. Like Black editor just got it. And yeah, so I feel that I was really lucky. So maybe that's something that I would suggest, that I think that editors too quickly jump to critique, jump to revision, and don't start with like, and I think, and I do agree with this as an editor myself, and also as a teacher, that you should really start with what is the book doing that you think is important, that you have invested in, before immediately deciding to just kind of like go in and fix everything. Then the second, what was the hardest part of the publishing process? Well, this book was but both books that I've published have been in some way impacted by COVID. So my first book was published November 2019. So I got 5 minutes of a tour, and then everything got canceled. It was so early in the pandemic that it was like nothing came back. Everything was just canceled. Nobody knew about Zoom yet. I feel like we all thought we were going to die. We all felt like everything was going to disappear. So I would say like that was really tricky. And then with Unwieldy Creatures, I started writing it in 2019. And so it was really, really challenging for me to finish it in the height of the hardest part of the pandemic, because I was like, the world just feels so hard and scary, and people are dying, and I don't want to write about this really heavy Frankenstein book. All of this is going on. So I felt really despondent about the book for a long time, and finishing it. And I was also going through a divorce, so there was like a lot of personal things happening in this. The journey of this book feels really miraculous, because my whole life was upended in the middle of writing this book. So the fact that I even finished it just feels truly just I'm just really touched by the fact that it even exists in a way. And so yeah, so finishing the second part of it was really brutal. I would say in general, the hardest part of the publishing process is always finding the right home for it. Figuring out if you want to go the agent traditionally published route or a small press route. Pros and cons to both, and really deciding this is like the home that you want, this is the home you want for your book. And when you make that decision, obviously you're saying no to a million potentials, right? So I think that that's always like the trickiest part. Yeah.
I love that because of course I've been following you for years on Facebook. I don't know if you know, but I have.
Oh, it's that long.
Right. I always like try to like almost like surprise, shock and awe people like, oh, I've been following you around for years, which I have. So I kind of know some of the stuff that you went through with your divorce. And it really gave me strength to I guess, see just like the collective, almost like support for you during that time and how you were kind of picking up the pieces, which leads in just so beautifully to the second question. What is or was your relationship with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and how has that evolved over the years, especially as you began work on unwieldy creatures?
All right, this is a big question.
Yes.
But no, it really means a lot to me that sharing my story was, inspiring and helpful for people. I was in my house alone, and so I just did what I like to call my emo posts on Instagram and Facebook. But and really I just had to do it. They're carefully created. They're still very curated. They're not just like me emptying out, but there are a lot of people that I think had been through similar experiences that really connected to what I was sharing. So that was actually something that happened during the pandemic, but also during this really difficult time in my life that really changed my relationship to social media in a really positive way. But okay, so Frankenstein. I first read Frankenstein when I was 19, so I was the same age actually that Mary Shelley was when she wrote the novel, and I read it in college in my romantics lit course. And I was, really taken with a few specific things about Frankenstein. As a mixed race person during a time where mixed race identity, biraciality was heavily, heavily stigmatized. I've always been really drawn to the creature story as other, and I think a lot of us were, especially because, I grew up at a time that we were reading only white text, like
Mhm.
the landscape that we're in now, where we really get to read biracial stories and stories by people of color was like not in existence when I was a teenager. So we had to find those spaces in the canon, and I think for a lot of us, Frankenstein, the story of the creature in Frankenstein was definitely one of them. And I was, as an identical twin, I was really intrigued by how Shelley kind of creates this mirroring dynamic between Frankenstein the creature, and even though they're having very different plights, they also almost say like some of the same things to describe their turmoil. I thought that was really fascinating, and I would not come to really deal with this for maybe 10 years after that, but my father's narcissism and my mother's abandonment were these key pieces that really connected me to Frankenstein. So that was Frankenstein part one. Frankenstein part two, about 10 years later, I got embroiled in a really toxic relationship with a narcissistic painter. That relationship ended in an abortion, was really traumatic. And we were like working on a show about Frankenstein. It was just too much. And after the abortion, I was like, I can't do this anymore. I can't continue to be enmeshed with narcissistic artists. What should I do about this? How do I figure this out? And I was in therapy, but I was like, I need to figure this out. So I was like, I know what I'll do. I'll reread Frankenstein as the self-help book and try to discover what narcissism is. So that was part two. And from that study, I decided, like, I think it would be really cool if there was some sort of dance adaptation of Frankenstein. Now, there have been some dance adaptations since the one that I helped collaborate on with Dominic Walsh. But at the time that we did that, nobody had done it. And so I pitched this idea to a choreographer whose work I really liked and who did a lot of literary adaptation work. Cole, didn't know him, only knew his performances. And And so yeah, so that was like Frankenstein too. And then but I should say between part one and part two, I had just become really kind of fixated on Frankenstein. So I had written prose poems, and um, I had written this, like, I haven't done anything with it, but this monologue where only the women speak, and it's called the Shelley monologues. It's sort of inspired by the vagina monologues, but it's like only the women in Frankenstein. So I'd written all of this creative work. And that and started to really research the stories behind Frankenstein, about Shelley, Mary and Percy Shelley, and just like all of the conditions around the publication of Frankenstein. And that led me to collaborate with Dominic Walsh on this dance production. And then Frankenstein Part 3, which is current, which is my writing of Unwieldy Creatures. I was starting to know, so a couple of things were happening. Three things were happening. I first of all starting to notice these this rising accelerated trend of novels in particular that were retelling, centering queer people, centering marginalized communities, people of color. Like, okay, that's interesting. Trying to see if don't really see that much happening with Frankenstein. So that was going on. Second thing that was going on was that the early abortion bans in Georgia were happening. And I was also noticing the rise in IVF and in vitro. And so to me, this seemed like a really interesting environment to stage a new Frankenstein. And also I was married, and I thought that I was also going to be having a child through in vitro. And so it was also like part of what was happening to me personally. And so so Frankenstein Part 3 was me deciding to write Unwieldy Creatures. And between part 2 and part 3, I also wrote a memoir. It hasn't been published yet. It got finalized a bunch of times, but I haven't sent it out in a while. But it's really just a memoir about my like love affair with Frankenstein, basically. So that's basically, I've been with this novel for more than 20 years of my life, so more than half of my life. I would have suspected in a million years that this random 19th century book would be something that would occupy me so deeply. But I think at this point I'm sure there's gonna be other things. It's just here to stay. So yeah.
Waiting for the other things. We have another question from Andrew Thornberry. As both an editor and an author, how much do you self-edit, or how do you keep yourself from getting caught over editing?
So the first thing is that I write somewhat fast, and the way that happens is that I've somehow been able to figure out how not to edit as I'm writing first drafts. So it's something I also teach my students. It's really hard, but you can always change it. You can always delete it. I just like let myself go. I do not have as heavy of an editing hand on myself as most writers that I know, because I really believe in the intuitive impulse that initially comes. So when I do edit, I'm really editing for fine-tuning the language, adding connections if there aren't connections. If I'm more just like writing the narrative, then I the second part I go in and I sort of think about what are the insights I want to really pull forward. But I don't, yeah, I don't, it's just an instinctual feeling. I want there to be that like magic. I don't need my sentences to be perfect. There are people that like obsess over flawless sentences. I don't really believe in that. Because I think like you get rid of some of the grittiness, some of the heart when you're too obsessed with the writing as perfection. And I also think that over editing comes from a self-consciousness of the audience. And so I just try to stay really centered on what I need it to say for me, what feels true to me. And like where you like like if you have an ice sculpture or something where you like fine tune an ice sculpture, but if you fine tune it too much, you will just shatter it. So it's like it's like a delicate balance. But you know, but I've been in this game for a long time. I mean, that's taken 2 decades for me to get to that place. And you know, I think the writers that get more attention than I do really obsess over the perfect sentence, and that it's just not my thing. I don't, that's not a I mean, I want my sentences to be beautiful and smart and well wrought, and the images to be really thoughtful and complicated, but I'm not writing those kind of books. I don't think I ever would write those kind of books. So, so I'm okay with that.
I love that. It's funny because I used to, when I first started writing, I loved those really long, like complex compound sentences, and like, and I had one, and I still remember it. My very first creative writing class, I had something like um the Minotaur or something. My teacher was like, no, you gotta you gotta get rid of that one sentence. I'm like, you're right, that sentence was too much. The devil's own Minotaur. It was like, yeah, that doesn't fit at all. It was laughable, but when you're first starting out. Our next question is Natalie Higgins. Um, Off the note of not having a background with languages you use in the book, how did you approach researching for the book, both the scientific material and the specifics of culture?
So let me think. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the science first. That's easier. I knew that I wanted to. I was like, oh, it'd be cool to have a Frankenstein who sometimes somehow figures out a way to create life without using sperm, sort of gender feminist based Frankenstein. Made it up, just not from anywhere, just my own brain. And then I was like, science is kind of wild, so let me go look this. And and that's when I learned that it's actually like very real. And so from that initial kind of Google search is when I learned that you could that experiments have been done successfully on laboratory mice with the science that I use in the novel, which is called in vitro gametogenesis, which basically is creating an embryo using stem cells. So it obviously has a lot of ethical issues because it means I could, bump into Janelle Monáe at a concert and like scrape her skin cells and like make a baby and like they would have no idea. So
reverse
yeah.
genetic engineer to the stem cells at the beginning of
Yeah. So, could get ornery. So what's really interesting about that discovery is that like not only do you not need sperm, you don't need egg either. So you still do need a womb, right? But I have a feeling that that will also be something that they'll be able to like engineer. And so yeah, so that's where the science came in. Now, so that was science I did through online research. I had a friend of mine who had a biology background help me with how to give the creature gigantism, like what needed to happen in the material that does end up creating ash for that to happen. So it's kind of a mixture of things. I will say I was most nervous about the science because there's a little bit of it in there, but I didn't really want to get into too much technicality. And a couple of people with science backgrounds read it, and it was totally fine, no issues. So I was I was very thrilled about that. Now, in terms of the Indonesian that's in the book, so there are a couple of things that are happening in the book. There's a Javanese wedding ceremony. There's a little bit of Indonesian, not very many Indonesian words actually. And there's a couple of scenes in Jakarta. So I did do really extensive Google research, but there's not that much in it. You know, it's very specific sequences. And I did hire an Indonesian sensitivity reader for those excerpts, and she was really great. There's only like there's one part of the wedding that I didn't get quite right, but she was actually very impressed with my research. She was like, it's always nice when someone's actually done research before in there.
All you
So,
students watching, remember that. Hey.
but yeah, highly, highly recommend that. The thing that you need to do is always hire what's called a sensitivity or an authenticity reader, which is somebody who has you hire them, they have the lived experience of the cultural background of the character, and then they only read it to discuss any problematic issues, any oft used tropes, any biases. And I have never heard, and I do sensitivity and authenticity reads, and I've never heard of one that's zero. There's always there, you know, even if
Mhm.
it's harmless, even if it would be okay, there's always something that you learn about how you've informed the book that could use some work. So yeah.
I used to get, I really try not to look at them now, but I used to actually get those kind of requests from Caucasian writers, and like they'd be writing like a native into their into their Western or whatever, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I just can't even. Like, I'm sorry, but you're gonna have to find someone else.
Yeah.
I can't.
Um, I'm trying to think. I was trying to think. Most of the sensitivity reads I've done have been like what I'm doing. They've been like Asian writers that are not Taiwanese writing Taiwanese people or something like that. There have been like straight like cis writers bringing in non-binary characters, and there's always like some, there's always some things. There's always things.
So, so I guess that kind of brings a like a question to my mind. Like, how do you navigate that with your students and their creative writing? Because I know that I've had to like very firmly tell a student in the past, this was like, I don't know, like 5 years, 6 years ago, that like you can't say this because you're making your character come across, as, white supremacist and racist in this context. And let me show you how you're doing that. And of course, I got some complaints, but I thought I explained it, very nicely. Like you shouldn't do this in this particular scene, and these are the reasons why.
Well, okay, so there's a couple of answers to that. Like in terms of like the pedagogical method, I do actually, there's this really great Tumblr account called Writing with Color that like lists every possible trope of every marginalized experience you can possibly think of, like disability, all people of color, asexual, like just everything. And I make them pick a trope that they intentionally subvert, and they have to write, so they have to actually write a story with a character with a different background as theirs, but they have to be actually like consciously subverting the trope. And the reason I do that, a lot of teachers I tell, they're like, oh no, because I teach at a production institution. But they're gonna do it. They're gonna do it out
Yeah.
there. So I
Mhm.
want them to do it in my classroom where they feel where it's safe, where they're not gonna get themselves into some like professionally like murky situations and work it out. And it's interesting because they're really nervous to do it. I'm like, but y'all are doing it out there. You need to do it in here. And I think that they're nervous
Mhm.
because I'm actually making them reckon with the long used tropes by white writers, by white neurotypical able-bodied writers. And I think that is the part that actually like intimidates them, but I think it's what they need to face. But in terms of like workshop, yeah, I mean, I feel like I do what you're talking about. I say like these are the things that will be problematic. This is why they're problematic. I have had to tell, like on my syllabus, they're not allowed to use hate speech. Like it doesn't matter if it's motivated by character, they just aren't like, and that's another thing that they also need to know. That's no longer acceptable in the publishing industry, thankfully, that if you're not of the background that is use of the character using hate speech, and you do not get to use it. You don't.
One of my favorite things is when like people try to use slang and they're just like totally not writing the character while using slang. I was like, no, you that's just too cliche. So we really talk about like our writing processes, which of course leads us into our next question. Addie, I would love if you could share a little bit about how you achieve the very level of individuality despite the story being a retelling of Frankenstein without relying on those tropes or cliches.
Hmm.
Question number 8 in the
Yeah,
track.
yeah.
Okay.
I think, you know, one of the things that makes me unusual in terms of writing this retelling is I don't actually think people who usually write retellings know the original the way that I know. Like, I like Frankenstein is just so close and dear to my heart. So the first thing I would say is that my book is absolutely a love letter to Mary Shelley. The the age is modern, but is very non-specific because I wanted to use a diction that would feel a little bit like a mashup of Shelley's language with like contemporary diction. I did that very purposefully. I wrote this book chapter by chapter in the sense that I like read Frankenstein chapter one, wrote chapter one, and then at some point my story took over, and so at that point it's sort of just like went into its own book. But in the very beginning, I was really I really hit beats that people never hit in Frankenstein retellings. That was another part of what I was trying to do. But I think like for me, I was really thinking about how to subvert some of the tropes that were in the original Frankenstein. And the biggest thing that I wanted to think about was like, we're always talking about narcissism among white men. Once upon a time, that word actually meant something. Doesn't really mean anything now because people just say it every 5 minutes about every possible
I
mildly
was
unpleasant
really triggered.
person.
Yeah.
Oh, such a narcissist, such a narcissist, yeah. So it actually has like a very serious meaning, but that meaning has been diluted. But this book really came from the question of, well, what would happen if our narcissistic creator was actually a queer woman of color? And another thing that I was looking at was making really toxic white masculinity ends up being the villain in this book rather than Frankenstein. And so the book, so Frankenstein is the way she is really because she doesn't deal with the trauma of her white male father. And Plum also has a toxic father, but her father is Asian, and she makes a decision to really reflect on where she comes from. And so it's those two different relationships to their psychological background in their childhood that really change their choices. And so these were things that I was thinking about. And I think like what ends up happening with retellings is a couple things. Either the books aren't really retellings, so they're like Romeo and Juliet, two kids with families who just don't like each other. That's Romeo and Juliet. or they can't really, the writers haven't really distinguished their own narrative choices away from the original. And so yeah, I think like, but I think that's what one of the joys about fiction is the minute you come up with your own characters, they really, I used to think it was cheesy when fiction writers talk like this. I'm a classically trained poet. I'm not actually a trained fiction writer at all. But when people talk about their characters like they're real people, I always thought it's like very like, okay. But it's true that like once you come up with the beginning of kind of a framework of a plot and distinct characters, they really take the story into a different cultural and physical landscape than the original. And that's like, but if you don't have an idea, if you're just like, oh, I really like XYZ classical canon, but you don't know how you want to really make a comment on it in this current framework. I don't think you should just retell a story for no reason. I think personally, I think you should be doing it
Please.
in a way that expands our understanding of the original against it in like contemporary time. And so for me, that means subverting the ideology that's embedded in the original to give it a different angle than we would have had back then. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I absolutely completely agree. Sometimes I see people using like memes of books or movies and they're totally out of context. I'm like, you apparently did not read the book, otherwise you would not be sharing that meme the way you're sharing
Oh
it.
my God. Also the
I mean,
Frankenstein film adaptations. I'm like, did y'all miss the whole point?
like I could go on a whole rant with you about that. And we have so many more questions from our live audience that will have to be brought up in our one-on-one class with you, which I have no problem with. To close out, again, Himakis Katsiayo, a huge thank you for your words and for your reading of them. We really need more of you in academia. And remember, when we tell our stories, whether written or oral, we are cultivating and expressing ourselves and experiential knowledge as a way to inform thinking and in various ways create connection to each other. Creative writing values narrative. And when we share our writing, we also share that integrated experiential knowledge drawn from a shared history as a people's ongoing struggle to transform a world through story and reciprocity to our community. We lift each other up. Just a little bit, please join us for 2 more readings in April for our next Visiting Writers series this spring, with in-person and Q&A with poet, author, and editor Gabrielle Calvacoresi. I really hope I said that right. Tuesday, April 2nd, 5 p.m. at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art in Pullman, Washington. You can also sign up for a 1-credit English 358 creative writing poetry workshop. That's Wednesday, April 3rd. Please contact your CAS advisor to sign up. And then later in April, reading and Q&A with poet and authors, first time for us doing this, and authors Stephen Dunn and Katie Jean Schinkel, Tuesday, April 16th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Again, Himakis Katsiaw Oikalo, huge thank you, everyone. Ka Addie and Addie Tsai, thank you for being here with us tonight. Yo, Kalo. That is all.
Thank you.